In the matter of the people of the state of California versus Orenthal James Simpson, case number BA096.
And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your
Sweet,
country
we're
can
back.
do
We're here
for you.
recording, Taylor. We are doomed to fail. Yes, I'm going to announce who we are at the top of the show.
Oh, my heart. Go ahead. I'm so
We are
proud of
doomed
you.
to fail. I'm Fars, joined here by Taylor. We are a twice weekly podcast covering some topics, most of all, ones that seem to be doomed to fail. And we are just getting going with today's episode, which should be released on Monday. How are you doing, Taylor?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm good. I'm pretty tired. I've had a very eventful weekend. I went to Fredericksburg, which is wine country, like an hour and a half outside of Austin, which was amazing. But it's like 3 hours of driving, and then you hang out, and then you go back home. And so, and I was just doing housework all day today. So this is a
Nice.
nice little reprieve from doing all that. But
Yeah.
yeah.
I'm happy to be inside. We had, I think, our last weekend of baseball games potentially, and so we had two games yesterday, and then today we had a hit-a-thon where like the kids will get to hit, and the person who hits the furthest gets a prize. And we didn't win any of those, but we did win a raffle prize, which is fun. We won like some artwork from one of the coaches who does these like cool stickers. Like I got this cute little sticker. She's this guy from Real Monsters.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Yeah, so it's fun.
Very cool. Very cool.
Yeah, yeah. But yeah, happy to be inside. I
I'm
know.
sure.
Sun.
I'm sure. Yeah, same here. It's in the 90s here in Texas now,
Mhm.
and man, summer started too soon.
You know, it's here. I'm like, oh, watch some gardening, and I'm like, no, the sun's out. Get back
Yeah,
up there.
yeah.
So,
All we have to
yeah.
look forward to is a cicada broods and a bunch of heat.
Are you gonna get the cicadas?
Yeah, yeah. So I think ours is the 13-year brood, and
Just the one?
yeah, just the one, just the 13-year one. And that should be happening between now and July.
Mm,
So we'll see. But I mean, yeah, it was always a thing here. I mean, not always, obviously, they don't come out every year, but like it's been a thing. I recall this happening before.
I remember when I was little, when I lived in Illinois, I remember hearing it. And then my father-in-law has sent us some videos from North Carolina where you can just like hear them because they got both
Oh, is
of
it? It's
them.
already happened. I guess. Yeah, I
Yeah,
guess it would have already started happening there. Okay.
yeah, it happened up there. He sent us a picture. They're gross. They're so big and like big, they're just like heavy. Like
They're big and
they're a heavy
there's
bug.
yeah, they're big and they're scary looking until you realize they're just really big dumb idiots. They're just stupid animals.
I
They're
know.
really dumb apparently. They're goofy and they die so easily. Apparently I was listening to this one podcast that said that the reason biologically why it makes sense for them to emerge in trillions is because the first wave just has to get eaten by everything. Like they're just
Right. They're
there.
not gonna make it.
Yeah, they're like cannon fodder. They're just there to get eaten by all the bugs and
The
or
infantry.
yeah, exactly.
It's so
Exactly.
funny.
So
Um, that I saw a lizard the other day and I kind of scared it. It was outside and I was like, oh hey. And then it like jumped and it ran into the garbage can and it hit its head on the garbage can and it made a little boop. It was just like really cute. It was just
so
like then it
cool.
like kind of shook its head and like ran the other way.
Yeah, I'm a huge we're a huge lizard family here.
Nice.
So I think I go first today.
You do. All
Okay.
you.
This one's gonna be a little bit weird
Great.
because it's a little open-ended and
Okay.
it's like there's a host of things that I'm thinking about lately that
Ooh,
I have not really absorbed and digested and totally understood in the context of like everything else that's going on in the world.
what's going
And
on?
so
You're having a
so
midlife crisis?
no. This
Okay.
all kind of it's interesting because what's going on with like Israel and Palestine,
Hmm.
it's brought up other thing. Here, I'll just segue
You
into
just
a little
go.
bit.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
obviously you've listened to Serial before, right?
Hmm.
So Serial, they're on season 3. Have you listened to season 3?
No.
Okay, season 3 is all about like these individual stories of people who have been detained by the US government in the war on terror.
Hmm.
And I think it's like 11 parts now. It's really interesting and I have very very mixed feelings about it because they make they try to personalize these stories in a way that I think just washes away like what they're culpable of. So like
Hmm.
neither here nor there. But in addition to that, I was just listening to Ezra Klein's podcast, and he had on a professor, a Yale Law School professor on international law. Her name was
Hmm.
Eslubu Bahi or Bal,
Hmm.
which I probably butchered, but and she was talking a lot about like what's going on with Israel and Palestine, the United Nations, and all that stuff. And she referenced how everybody we now people are looking at the situation saying the US or Israel's overreacting to Israel or to Palestine.
Hmm.
And it's like, yeah, but we also did the exact same thing and nobody said anything to us. We way overreacted in the war on terror. We did a bunch of stuff that would
Oh
have
yeah.
been against international law. And it's funny how when we do it, nobody seems to we
I
don't
mean, there were
plan to
plenty of people
focus
protesting when we did it.
towards like after like the meat of it came out. And so that's
Hmm.
actually what I'm kind of going into here. I was gonna start by doing basically a story on Gitmo, but then there's other stuff that was going on that I started digging into the precursors of what happens to someone before they get to Gitmo. And so that's kind of like this
Hmm.
weird overarching story of what I wanted to kind of cover because also Taylor, like we forget this, but we're kind of old. Like
I know.
these are all 23-year-old events.
I've
Like
been thinking that too. Yeah, with some of my stuff, what I'll talk about, and I told you I was going to talk about the internet a little bit, and we talked about that last week, this week, but yeah, no, we're old.
and that's when I was
So
listening to
interesting.
this Ezra Klein episode, and she
Yeah,
was like, do we all forget how over the top we were back then when this
yeah,
happened?" And I was like, "Yeah, kind of. It's kind of just like washed away of like, well, that was a crazy time, wasn't it?" And we
I
just kind
know.
of moved on. And so I'm gonna go into that basically. It's like a little bit of a story about Guantanamo Bay, but also like some other topics that are around there. So I'll just dive right into kind of the history of Guantanamo Bay and like why we even have a piece of Cuba, which is a little bit weird.
Yeah, yeah.
So
Question.
Guantanamo Bay, it is a bay on the southeastern tip of Cuba with an inlet that starts at the Caribbean Sea and winds north approximately 12 miles into Cuba. Today, we recognize Cuba as an authoritarian state ruled by the Communist Party, which came about in the 1950s during the Cuban Revolution. But the precursor of all of that was the Spanish-American War.
Hmm.
So that start, and I'm sure I think you touched on this before.
I feel
Um,
like I always think about the sinking of the Maine. When
yeah,
people
yeah,
think,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah. That was one of the precursors to all of this. So
Hmm.
the Spanish-American War started in 1898, and that was between the United States and Spain for a variety of reasons, which you actually just called out one of them. The sinking the USS Maine was one of them. The other one was they were I was it McKinley? Yeah, the media was calling McKinley, weak, and
Hmm.
basically there was a bunch of like just shoring up support for a war against Spain. At this time, the biggest reason was obviously the economic and military interests the United States had in Cuba. Apparently, sugar imports from Cuba were a huge, huge deal, and the instability that Spain was causing because Spain was a brutal they were brutalizing the Cuban people and that was causing a lot of issues. So the U.S. started taking interest in Cuba and by extension of that, Spain and declared war. This war only lasted 3.5 months. It was an incredibly, incredibly quick defeat between the U.S. and Spain. So for about 4 years after that war, which lasted again 3.5 months, the U.S. maintained operational and government control over the island, and it established a government and prepared Cuba for independence.
Hmm.
The U.S. wanted to prevent having to intervene militarily into Cuban affairs again, and so what they decided to do was that they were going to establish naval command over part of the island, and they were going to do that by signing this lease with the then established government of Cuba in 1902 for a perpetual lease for Guantanamo Bay for a price of $2,000 per year, which was later changed to $3,700 and then later on to $4,000 a year. So that was the genesis of why we have Guantanamo Bay.
Is that what we're still paying for it?
We are now paying $4,085 per year.
Wow.
Yeah, it's a
That's
bargain.
that's a lot less than I pay for my home
It is.
per
It is
year.
also. It's weird to think about because you hear Guantanamo Bay and you just envision the worst things ever. You look up
Hmm.
pictures. It is gorgeous there.
I'm
Like it
sure it
is
is. I'm sure. I mean,
stunning.
I haven't been to Cuba, but obviously, but I've been to like Puerto Rico and the Bahamas and other Caribbean places, and it's beautiful down there.
Totally, totally.
Yeah.
So the purpose of the lease, again, it was so that the U.S. had some sort of command over the island, and what they essentially established was a naval facility on the island on this southeastern tip. The property itself contains the naval station. It's called Naval Station Guantanamo Bay, NSGB, and that's just naval logistics for the fleet operating in the Caribbean. There's Leeward Point Field, which is an airfield. There's Hospital Point, which is self-explanatory. There's training areas. There's Family Support Center to provide support and services to the military personnel that live there. Residential areas, restaurants, homes, shopping centers, schools, things like that. And
Mm-hmm.
then there is the detention camps.
It's
So
crazy.
the original detention camps at Gitmo were Camp Delta, Camp Echo, Camp Iguana, and Camp X-Ray. So why did we start doing this in the first place? Like again, I'm kind of taking it as just understood that we house people at Gitmo,
Mm-hmm.
but if you're not in your near 40s, that might not be a foregone conclusion. So bear with me on this. The origin of how folks ended up, why the U.S. decided to house people on Guantanamo Bay really starts by examining the concept known as black sites. So are you familiar with this term?
I can guess what that means.
It's bad, right? I
That
mean,
it's
you
like
don't.
bad and very
Yeah,
secretive,
yeah.
right?
You don't need to know anything. Like it. The term is very self-explanatory. So,
Yeah.
in the immediate aftermath of September 11th, basically the government said we're not sparing any expense, any sort of moral justifications in terms of figuring out what happened, who's responsible, and how we can bring them to justice, and realistically to prevent this from happening ever again. So they went about establishing the CIA went about establishing secret prisons, which are known as black sites, in a bunch of different countries, not in the U.S. for obvious reasons.
Mm-hmm.
And the entire point was for them to outside of transparent channels like the judiciary collect intelligence from high value targets, essentially.
Yeah.
So we actually don't know exactly where these facilities are or really how many of them there are. All we know is, again, they're all outside of the US and they're all outside the ability for the US, for any entity to provide public scrutiny on it.
Mm-hmm.
So the method the CIA used to basically find the people that they would stuff into these black sites was a concept known as extraordinary rendition. So basically, the US understandably doesn't want to tip off these other countries. They don't want to let them know they're operating there. They don't want to let them know what they're intending on doing. And so, if somebody at the CIA suspected that an individual in a foreign country was, a high value target in this war against terror, then
Mm-hmm.
they would basically monitor and track them until the time was right, and then just abduct them. So
Mm-hmm.
they would blindfold, shackle, and put diapers on them, and typically put them on a military flight, and they'd typically be shackled to the cargo area. That's why they were wearing diapers, because it would just go wherever you're going to go. And they'd
Yeah.
be flown to a black site. There's so many details here that I didn't actually write out, but there was a period of time where I don't know who the governing body was for this, but in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, essentially every country more or less agreed that the US was allowed to operate and fly aircraft without any call signs over their territory. Like it was basically like, hey, like in this, do your thing. We're not going to ask any questions.
Yeah.
Kind of a
Yeah.
situation.
I mean, I feel like everything you're saying is like, I feel like we are conditioned to be like, well, of course we have to have spies, because it's like all kind of like what I was talking about last week. It's like all mutually assured spying on each other, you know?
Yeah. Yeah.
And so like
Yeah.
I'm like, a part of me is like, yeah, totally, of course we have black sites. And then part of me is like, why would we ever have to do that? But also like, you know,
Yeah.
it's
So
just the world we live in.
I I
Is
do
it?
I
I don't
I
know.
do I do want to have like an aside conversation about like
Yeah.
about that piece. We'll get to that here in a minute. So at this point, this individual, hypothetically, if you picture yourself, you're shackled to this aircraft carrier or aircraft, and you are
Hmm.
at this point referred to colloquially as a ghost detainee, basically someone that doesn't exist anymore. Nobody knows
Hmm.
where you are. Your government doesn't know where you are. Your family doesn't know where you are. You're just kind of whisked away. Again, there's no flight records. There's no prison records. You're just gone.
Right.
That's how they'd essentially land at black sites where they'd be subject to what is I mean, essentially torture, but
Yeah.
the government calls it enhanced interrogation. The CIA
Yeah.
approved methods being waterboarding, hypothermia, stress positioning, which would be things like you'd have your hands shackled to something above your head, holding you up that
Mm-hmm.
way. But then you'd also be shackled to the floor, so you'd have to stand for long periods of time.
It's like really uncomfortable.
Very uncomfortable, slapping around that face and body. There's other branches of government that have other approved methods, such as loud music or sleep deprivation or using dogs or other things to instill fear and intimidation.
Mm-hmm.
But again, like we don't really actually know what happens to these black sites. Like that's what's being talked about and approved. I think you can basically do whatever you want at a black site. It
I
feels
think you
like
can too.
you're kind of just like there. And
Yeah.
we do know that prisoners have died at other facilities, such as we know for a fact at Gitmo or at Abu Ghraib in the past. And
Mm-hmm.
so it's totally plausible that worse things happen at black sites.
Yeah.
But over time, as the heat on the war on terror kind of started to simmer down and investigative journalists started digging into these disappearances, the US government realized it might be in everyone's best interest if they stopped kidnapping these people and putting them on foreign soil. And to make the process even a little bit more transparent, not a
Mm-hmm.
lot, but just a little bit more. The problem was they didn't want them to have any legal rights, and that would slow everything down. And you don't want it to slow down because these people could have information that they could prevent a future attack.
Right.
So like again, to your point, like purely from like a human utopic perspective, bad thing.
Yes.
But also, what else are you
We
supposed to
have
do?
exactly. I don't know. It's such a good question.
So so basically the government looked around and they decided that Guantanamo Bay was the perfect place. Basically, in theory, it is on sovereign land that the US doesn't own because it's a lease after all. It is
Mm-hmm.
therefore not subject to judicial oversight. And so they're like, look,
Mm-hmm.
we'll go ahead and put these people there. Basically, they wanted Colin Powell and Condoleezza Rice basically want everybody to stop yelling at them, and they're like, "We'll just do this.
That's
That'll be
fair.
the easy way to get around this."
Mm-hmm.
The way I kind of understood it was that a detainee could graduate, so to speak, from a black site to Gitmo. So that doesn't mean that that everything just ended up at Gitmo. So like black sites still were operational. There were still a large number of detainees that were there. It was just that some people were also stationed here. So in January 11th of 2002 is when Camp X-Ray, the first kind of temporary camp, opened.
Mm-hmm.
And at that time, it accepted 25 detainees. At that point, the US allowed some organizations to visit. So, for example, they had the International Red Cross visit. They also had the FBI show up and do forensics to determine whether torture had occurred there or not. But otherwise, their identities and everything else was kept secret. If you look up pictures from this time, you'll notice that there's really nothing identifiable about the people who were detained there. They're all wearing masks. You can't see their face. You actually have
Mm-hmm.
no idea who they are. Camp Delta contains the actual entire detention facility. That's what opened up after Camp X-Ray kind of stopped being its temporary little thing, and Camp
Mm-hmm.
Delta was like the legitimate one. And basically, it's run and operates to the standards of a maximum security prison, and contains other camps within it. So detainees would move around between these facilities based on things like how valuable the information they could provide was, or how cooperative they are, therefore
Mm-hmm.
how much privilege they would basically get,
Mm-hmm.
um, how high risk they are to do things like self-harm, whether they are suffering from any psychological issues, and also whether they're minors or not. Because believe it or not, there's one camp called Camp Iguana, which actually sounds kind of charming after you just described your lizard experience. It was actually a detainee camp for minors. It was for kids.
No.
And so that's the keep them.
I hate that. And that's really, I almost hate that because those poor kids. I mean, they've probably potentially been, what is your life like if you end up there? It's been
Yeah, you're right.
terrible.
Yeah, like your life's ruined.
Yeah.
Absolutely. There was also Camp Echo, which seemed it was mostly afforded to prisoners or detainees who got more privileged access to things like exercise facilities and stuff like that. Then there was Camp No, which again doesn't sound good. It was apparently another black site that again nobody knows this stuff. We're just kind of intuiting it. So apparently it was sort of at Gitmo, but they had a carve out around the boundary line of Gitmo so that it was technically in Cuba, but no Cubans would walk over there, so it was part of Gitmo effectively. And it was
Hmm.
assumed that it was run by the CIA. We don't know exactly all the details. The camp was described as having no guard tower, but surrounded by what was called or what's known as concertina wire, which is basically that gnarly curled up barbed wire,
Hmm.
Personnel working at Gitmo would say that they have observed detainees transferred over to this facility and that non-uniformed personnel seem to be working there, which heavily implies it's a CIA-run operation.
Hmm.
There are two other such facilities that exist but kind of don't exist within the boundaries of Camp Delta at Guantanamo Bay. One is called Strawberry Fields, which at this point I think they're just trying to be cheeky with their terminology.
Yeah.
This is the same concept as Guantanamo Bay, except these people probably would never have been released, but for this one ruling called Rasul versus Bush, which basically granted Gitmo detainees access to habeas corpus by the Supreme Court. The original intent, it sounds like, of Strawberry Fields was that's a place you go to just be held forever. That's it. Like you're basically just buried alive. Penny Lane, this was like I hate to weird to use this term, but this was in theory like the most luxurious version of the camps. This was where
Hmm.
basically double agents would be trained up. So if they caught somebody like an Al Qaeda member, they would train them up to basically be a double agent and send them back into the field. I have no idea how this works. I imagine all these people were like, I'm just gonna get shot in the head one way or another. It's either these guys who shoot me in the head or the next guy shoots me in the head. I have no
For
idea.
real. I mean, like, stories of people who are like double or triple agents, I'm like, I don't know, man.
Just
Like, you are walking a fine line of being murdered.
it's kind of like once you're in this boat, you're just gonna drown. Like there's no
Yeah.
getting out of this
Yeah.
situation.
Yeah.
So going back to the Supreme Court aspect of all this, part of the reason I'm assuming everybody understands this, the part of the reason why we did this was based on a concept within the Geneva Convention, which the U.S. helped to write, which mandates humane treatment, the right to legal counsel, and the right not to be tortured for prisoners of war once they're captured. The U.S. argued that technically they can do all of this stuff because the people captured are unlawful enemy combatants, which is a term of art saying that, hey, these people aren't fighting on behalf of a government when they were captured, therefore subject to the Geneva Convention. These people were operating outside of that. And so
Hmm.
why Gitmo originally, at least, could operate largely in secrecy and with very limited access for its detainees to legal rights. In the years since it started functioning as a detainee center until now, usage has basically been declining year over year. So at its height, it held 680 detainees. Now it's somewhere around 40. And
Whoa.
yeah, so Obama tried to outright shut it down and he was blocked by Congress.
I
Trump,
remember that was part of his promises, campaign promises, right?
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And then Trump, by executive order, basically removed all restrictions and access to be able to use the camp. But that didn't matter. Like I think he was mostly just doing it as like I'm tough on crime kind of a guy versus like
Hmm.
the actual intelligence and military needs weren't really there. And so it didn't result in a dramatic increase in usage. And Biden also said he's going to try and shut down Guantanamo Bay, which is weird because I'm like, who's talking about this still? Like, is this still a
Yeah.
campaign issue? But he basically kept mostly nothing has really changed since Trump. So like, but it doesn't matter because it was naturally decreasing in usage anyway. So it was having like a natural death, and so there was no need to really go overboard about it. As of right now, there's one person who has been there since almost day one, and that's Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, KSM, which was essentially considered the mastermind of the 9/11 attack. He also
Mm.
was the mastermind between the 1993 World Trade Center bombing as well. So like he really had a thing against the World Trade Center. Again, part of the point of the serial episodes I listened to was very these people are basically here indefinitely and maybe what we're doing to them isn't right. It was very like pro the detainees in a way that was a
Hmm.
little bit like I get it. Like a very progressive viewpoint is let's let this slide. But at the same time, like what are you supposed to do? a guy like this, he's been in detention for 20 years without really any formal charges. I mean, he's had some charges here and there, but right as of right now, he's awaiting a death penalty case for the 9/11 attack, and he's been awaiting it pretty much since 2003. He was most
Hmm.
recently postponed on a hearing in 2023. So 20 years on, and he's still waiting to have his hearing. And so that's kind of where I left it with what's going on with the entire insanity around the war on terror between the extraordinary rendition of black sites to ghost detainees to Gitmo transfers to all. It's just a crazy hodgepodge mess of like. But again, to the earlier point, what else are you supposed to do? Like,
Yeah.
you kind of have to. So this also led me down this other track where I was reading about the 9/11 actual hijackers, and
Uh-huh.
one of them, no, it wasn't one of them. It was like five or six of them that Mossad had actually told the U.S. government about. Like the spy agencies conferred with each other on this, and they knew that they were here doing shady shit, and still nothing happened, which is awful.
It's awful. And I actually am going to talk about that a little bit on my section as well, is like we don't need all of this like advanced interrogation as much as we need like a CRM. The government needs to just like talk to each other, you
Yeah,
know? Like if one side of the government knows something about these people and another side like is trying to find this, like talk to each other. Like they don't talk to each other. And I've read like several books that just like point that out again and again. And you're like, oh my God, like I thought you feel like we should be past this because we hear stories of like true crime and like a long time ago when like, they're looking for this person in this county, but not in this county and they never found them, you know? But like now we should be able to share information and like they don't.
yeah. I was re-listening actually to the last podcast, Oklahoma City bombing episode,
I'm gonna talk about that too. We're on
and
the same page.
that was basically the point, was that every agency knew a piece of the puzzle, but they didn't want to share with each other because they all wanted to like back the group and back the people, the baddies. And
Hmm.
it was just a missed opportunity based on lack of cooperation and not looking out for the bigger picture, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's a self-fulfilling prophecy with like all of this military stuff. It's like if you want to create these, people who are terrorists and they're gonna fit the mold you put them in, you know?
I will say that on a personal level, I don't totally have an issue with the government spying on its citizens.
I know. And actually, this is so much overlap, but I just was reading a book that I've not finished reading, but they're talking about how a lot of the things the government can do is they can like hold on to information but not look at it and be like, we'll look at it later if we need to, you know? So that's how they can like get around being like, we're not spying on everyone. Like we're just like holding your information in case you do something wrong. Then we're gonna go back and look through what you've done. You know, like when we suspect you of something, we'll look back on all that stuff. But I'm
Yeah.
also like fine with cookies because I'm like, don't show me ads for shit I don't want. Show me ads for stuff I want.
Yeah, I'm totally cool with the surveillance state that we're
I'm
in.
past that.
I
Yeah.
will the it's interesting because if 9/11 hadn't happened, you wouldn't have known that 9/11 hadn't happened. And so it's easy, I think now we look at like Snowden and the prison program and all that stuff, and we're like, this is awful. The government's doing all this stuff. It's like, yeah, but you don't know what didn't happen because they did that, you know?
Right. If they had, or what they've stopped potentially since then.
Yeah.
Yeah. I
So I don't know.
I'm I would rather have them read my emails than not go through 9/11 again.
Go
Those
even
are my
further.
choices.
Like, go even further. Like if you could actually preempt any like school shooters, like do that too.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know.
That's I mean, those people are fucking saying that shit online all the time anyway, you know? Like they always look back and they're like, "Oh, look, that person said he's going to kill everybody at school on Reddit." You're like, "Well, someone should have gone and checked on him."
Yeah, so that's what I'm saying. I'm saying surveil more.
Yeah. I agree. I'm not doing anything wrong, so I agree, which is probably not the stance that I should have, but also I'm like, I'd like them to stop the baddies.
Yeah, we're on the same page. We're on the same page. I
Yeah.
don't know where that aligns. That's one of the things I was thinking about when I was thinking about the Ezra Klein show. I was like, I have no idea when he's talking to someone, like, are they liberal or conservative?
Hmm.
I have no, which is like a sign of like a really good interviewer, which is like, I
Totally.
have no idea. Like, it says reclined, so you know what he is, but like, still, like,
Yeah, you're
just
like, I'm just listening to
listening.
this person's thoughts on this thing. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So, anyways,
Interesting.
that's my story. I know it's not, there wasn't like a ton here, but like, I just went down this rabbit hole. The serial, listen to the serial thing because I listened to all of them back to back. I was pretty obsessed with it. And I walked away not feeling the way I think they wanted the audience to feel, but I'm curious if anybody else has listened to it to write in at last. What's our show called?
Doomed to fail. Horace has just plugged like 7,000 other podcasts in this episode. So if you are looking for something to listen to, Faraz will plug 7,000 other podcasts for you in this episode.
We are doomed to fail. Write to us at doomedtofailpod@gmail.com and tell us if you listen as oh my god. The serial podcast, season 3. I'm gonna stop talking, Taylor. You gotta take over.
Um, yeah, let us know what you think about all these things. It's a complex question, and thank you, Faraz, for bringing it up. And I want to, yeah, it's those, there's so many things happening right now that are like, oh, I'm going to talk about this too. Let's just get to mine. That are like science fiction, but happening in real life. And not science fiction, but like crime fiction. Like all that stuff like has happened, and that I think is something that's interesting that like, well, I'll tell you about this in 5 minutes, but a lot of things that happened in like 1980s about the internet, they happened in movies first. And then the government was like, oh no, could that really happen? And then they were like, oh shit, yeah. Like whatever you can imagine, it's probably happening or has happened.
Yeah, yeah, for
And
sure.
that's which is crazy.
Yeah. Wow. You just is this everything everywhere all at once?
I didn't
Talking.
see that yet.
It's not good.
I feel stressed out about it because I feel like I'm supposed to think it's good. And I don't know if I'm going to. And oh my God, last night I went to the movies and saw If, the new children's movie about imaginary friends, and it was awful. It was like
Yikes.
Ryan Reynolds again, just like, do you
Playing
do
Ryan Reynolds.
can you do anything else? It's so weird. Like, do you
Yeah.
have any other tone in your voice? I don't think so. Have you ever
Yeah.
played any other character but yourself? Anyway, wildly bad.
Okay.
Yeah.
Here's the thing. I don't want anybody to feel bullied into liking movies that aren't good. I watched that movie because everywhere, everything, all at once, whatever it's called, because everybody. I was being told that it's the best thing I'm ever gonna see, and it's gonna blow my mind. It's gonna be the most amazing thing. And I watched it like, this is just nonsense. Like I don't like.
That's why I'm afraid to see it because I've already heard that. So like when someone says that, you're like, oh shit,
Wait,
like
you've heard that because I brought that up and I got like lambasted for
no,
saying that.
no. I've heard that it was great. So that's
Yeah.
that makes me nervous to watch it because I'm worried that I'm not gonna love it, and then I'm gonna have to like live with that, and then like I don't know, live like you.
Hey, live your truth. Live your truth.
Live your truth, everyone. Like what you like. That's not the lesson of this episode, but um,
Yeah, let's end the Gitmo episode like what you like. Um. Anyways, okay, so that's the episode. Is there anything you want to tell us, Taylor, before we bounce and go to your episode?
I do. I want to share this in a more professional way later, but my husband, Juan Carlos, has a website called readjuancarlos.com. And on it, he talks a lot about mental models and decision making. And he has this really cool deck of cards that he just made. He has a book you can download, a deck of cards with like over 100 different mental models and ways of thinking on them. And I was going through the deck the other day, and two of them we talked about in our last episodes, mutually assured destruction and the Swiss cheese model are both one of the cards in his deck. So I took pictures of them and I'll share them and tell everybody where to buy it because it's super interesting and helpful for, you know, jobs, group people, just thinking about how you're thinking and different strategies. So I will share it.
Love it. He also has an app.
And it's an app, Mental Models app.
There you go, and it's free to download.
Hmm.
Nice.
Everywhere
Okay.
you download apps. Yeah.
Awesome. Awesome. Way to go. Sweet. Anything else?
Nope. Find us on social, Doom to Fail Pod on everything. I don't know. Our website, we need to talk about it because I can't get it to work, which is such a
We are
bummer because it's so good, but the DNS isn't working. I don't know why.
um we can take this offline.
Yeah. I'll take it offline. We'll do it later.
Yes, find us at doomnofell pod on the socials and write to us at doomnofellpod@gmail.com.
Yay.
Sweet.
Thank you.
Thanks, Taylor.